Hi, everyone, and welcome to Inside the Americas. Coming up on this week's edition, the U.S. is sending tens of billions of dollars to Ukraine. And to get it there fast, President Biden has signed a decades-old measure called the Lend-Lease program. We'll tell you what it's about. Investigators are trying to determine who was behind the assassination of Paraguay's prosecutor of organized crime and drug trafficking. He was shot and killed while on his honeymoon. Former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is trying to stage a political comeback. The 76-year-old is looking to become president once again and to unseat far-right leader Jair Bolsonaro. We're going to start off with the rush to get weapons and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. The U.S. has pledged tens of billions of dollars to Kyiv. And with time of the essence, President Biden has signed legislation that was last used during World War II. Catherine Viette has more.
With the stroke of a pen, the U.S. has made sending weapons and aid to Ukraine that much easier.
I'm signing a bill that provides another important tool in our efforts to support the government of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in their fight to defend their country and their democracy against Putin's brutal war.
The Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act of 2022 is essentially an update of World War II-era legislation that allowed America to help her allies and those nations fighting Nazi Germany. Under the terms of the new law, Washington can lend or lease military equipment to Ukraine and other Eastern European countries affected by Russia's war with fewer bureaucratic hurdles. Aid also won't be contingent on Kyiv's ability to pay. Over 8 decades ago, the U.S. first introduced the Lend-Lease program to help send much-needed weaponry to Great Britain and other nations battling Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, including Soviet Russia. As Russia celebrates its role in the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Kremlin will be reflecting that the victory came with help from the Americans, as Joseph Stalin said himself. Under the original Lend-Lease program, the U.S. transferred to the Soviet Union 7,000 tanks, 51,000 jeeps, 376,000 trucks, 132,000 machine guns, as well as food and clothing. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it justified its decision by saying it was necessary to denazify the country. Now, a Lend-Lease program that once helped the Kremlin to defeat fascism will be used by Kyiv to help stop Russia's aggression.
And for more on this, we're joined by France 24's Doug Herbert. Doug, so this is called the Ukraine Democracy Defense Lend-Lease Act of 2022. That's a mouthful, but let's focus on those two words, Lend-Lease. What do they mean?
Anyone who knows their American history, Lend-Lease has enormous significance. It was basically the act that Franklin Roosevelt, during the war, got passed by the U.S. Congress in order basically to come to the aid of allies, but most notably Great Britain, who were at the time essentially fighting Hitler's Nazis on their own. What happened is in late 1940, the Brits had run out of money. They had no cash to pay the U.S. for the arms they needed to fight the Nazis. That was required under U.S. law. So what Roosevelt had to do is he came up with this plan, Lend-Lease, suggested to the British, signed in 1941. It was a very tough sell to Congress. He basically said, listen, the idea is the Brits can't pay us now for these weapons. They need it to defend democracy against autocracy, against Nazi aggression. It's really a battle not just for Britain, it's a battle for democracy in the world, very similar to what we're hearing today. It was a tough sell in Congress because at the time America was full of isolationists, including the aviation hero Charles Lindbergh, who pleaded with Congress not to accept this Lend-Lease deal. It passed in March 1941, and as a result, we know the rest is literally history. It enabled Britain to more ably defend itself, but it wasn't just Britain. Here's the arch irony. Lend-Lease Act back then, which allowed the U.S. to lend, sell, or lease military hardware to countries designated as vital to national security, basically at the time, it enabled Britain to go on eventually and be one of the leading thrusts in the D-Day, the Normandy landings, which were the beginning of the end for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. So Lend-Lease resonates across the decades, 81 years ago, but may as well be fresh today because it's being used on the same pretext for Biden in the case of helping Ukraine to fend off a new type of Nazi-style aggression from from Russia.
So a big symbolic importance. So the U.S. is already sending a lot of help to Ukraine. What will this act enable the U.S. to do that it's not already doing? And how will Vladimir Putin react?
Yeah, well, let's get the first part there is pretty easy. It will immediately allow those weapons supplies, those deliveries, to get there a lot faster. Lend-Lease basically lifts all these bureaucratic obstacles that might stand in the way of quick, efficient delivery of weapons and military hardware. And Ukraine has been pleading. They need the weapons now. This is when the war is ramping up seriously across the east in the Donbass region, across the south. Putin isn't slowing down. He's going to be replenishing his troops and perhaps mobilizing. So right now, it is vital, perhaps more than ever, Monty, to get all of those weapons there quickly. So it lifts the obstacles for anti-aircraft weapons, for anti-tank weapons, and ammunition, and so on and so forth. Putin, as you can imagine, there is alarm in the Kremlin. Even if they're not overtly acknowledging it, they're clearly going to now, the Russians, in the next days and weeks, they've already been doing it, ramping up their strikes at the weapons inflows. They see this Lend-Lease program as potentially offering Ukraine the chance to really efficiently defend itself if these weapons can get through a lot quicker. The Kremlin, the propagandists are hard at work trying to discredit the Lend-Lease Act, trying to paint it as basically a cynical move by the U.S. economy and business people in cahoots with politicians to try to finance the weapons manufacturers in the U.S. Some would say, well, is there a grain of truth in that? And to basically humiliate Russia all the same. It's going to perhaps galvanize Russia. Putin is angrier than ever, and they say that this could perhaps also very much make any prospect of negotiations with Ukraine, but with Russia and Ukraine, a further distant prospect than ever before.
Okay, France 24's Doug Herbert. Doug, thanks as always. Well, investigators are trying to determine who was behind the assassination of Paraguay's prosecutor of organized crime and drug trafficking. Marcelo Pecci was killed Tuesday in Colombia on the island of Peru, where he was on his honeymoon with his wife. Witnesses said the gunman arrived on a jet ski and shot the couple while they were on the beach. Carolyn Lembele with the story.
An attack typical of the drug mafia. This is how a fellow Paraguayan prosecutor described the assassination of Marcelo Pecci, who was known for his work in fighting organized crime. He was shot dead by two men aboard a jet ski on Tuesday near the coastal Colombian city of Cartagena, where he was honeymooning with his new wife. Marcelo Pecci, who was 45 years old, and the journalist Claudia Aguilera married on 30 April this year. The news of Pecci's assassination came as a shock for the Paraguayan authorities.
Rest assured that we will double up our efforts to continue fighting against organized crime, against transnational crime, and against drug trafficking. This is on behalf of Marcelo and all of the prosecutors who risk their lives every day for their work, for their fight.
5 Colombian homicide investigators have been dispatched to the tourist island of Baru, where Pecci was killed.
It is very painful, very hard. I spoke with Colombian President Ivan Duque on the phone, and he promised me that he would give us all his support to solve the case, to look for those responsible.
In a country where corruption is rampant, Marcelo Pecci was known for his transparency. He played a leading role in several major operations against organized crime and money laundering. Colombian police have promised nearly $490,000 to anyone who will help find and identify the prosecutor's killers. Colombia still ranks first as the world's largest producer of cocaine. It's currently facing a surge in violence related to drug cartels.
Time now for a look at other regional news in brief, starting with Mexico, where 2 journalists were killed Monday, raising to 11 the number of journalists killed in the country this year.
2 more journalists murdered this week in Mexico. One was the head of a news website, the other a reporter. They were shot dead in the eastern state of Veracruz. It brings the number of journalists killed in the country since the start of the year to 11, with nearly 150 murdered since the year 2000, according to the NGO Reporters Without Borders. One by one, these inmates are hauled back into the prison they escaped from. On Monday, about 200 of them took their chance to flee as a riot broke out between 2 rival gangs. Several dozen people were killed in the violent clashes that ensued.
Most of the victims were killed with a knife, not with a firearm. and most of the bodies were found in the wards and in the cells.
Violence linked to drug trafficking is common in Ecuador's overcrowded prisons. Nearly 400 inmates have died since February 2021. In the Brazilian town of Tubarão, 800 kilometers south of Sao Paulo, residents have taken to their boats. The river overflowed following a week of torrential rain, bringing devastating floods to the southern state of Santa Catarina. Local authorities have declared a state of emergency in more than 20 towns there.
He is considered the most popular president in Brazilian history. After falling from grace and being jailed for corruption, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is staging a political comeback. The 76-year-old is looking to become president once again and to unseat far-right President Jair Bolsonaro. Laurent Berstecker has more.
Back into the spotlight after 12 years on the sidelines, at 76 years old, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is ready to lead Brazil for a third time. The stakes have never been higher for the former president, who's looking to preserve and protect what's left of his legacy after 4 years of Jair Bolsonaro.
We will never act like our opponent, who tries to mask his incompetence by picking fights with everyone and lying 7 times a day.
After 2 successful stints as president in 2002 and 2006, Lula was unable to run for a third consecutive term and stepped down in 2010 with a staggering 83% approval rating. During his time in office, he raised the minimum wage and implemented a series of social programs, lifting more than 30 million Brazilians out of poverty. But Lula's journey soon took a tragic turn, as he was placed under investigation for his role in a sprawling corruption scandal known as Operation Car Wash. In 2017, he was found guilty of granting lucrative government contracts in exchange for an apartment and was sentenced to 12 years in jail. The former president always claimed his innocence and denounced a conspiracy to bar him from running in the 2018 elections.
I was the victim of one of the greatest political and legal persecutions in this country's history.
In 2019, Lula was released from prison pending an appeal, much to the joy of his supporters. And in 2021, his conviction was thrown out by a judge on procedural grounds. Since then, the 76-year-old has been preparing his political comeback. He officially launched his campaign in May 2022 with an ambitious program, reopening Brazil's economy, supporting poor and indigenous communities, protecting the rainforests, and restoring the country's international image. A tall order for which Lula assembled a broad coalition, picking center-right politician Geraldo Alckmin, his former presidential rival in 2006, as his running mate, to help him unseat Jair Bolsonaro.
It is the most expensive 20th century artwork ever sold at an auction, and it's our number of the week, $195 million. This for the iconic Andy Warhol portrait of Marilyn Monroe. It's called Shot Sage Blue Marilyn. The portrait was owned by a late art dealer, and the proceeds from the sale are being donated to charities that provide medical and educational services to children. The buyer was not named by the auction house. That's it for this edition of Inside the Americas. There's more world news coming up right here on France 24. Stay with us.